The funeral was quiet and dignified, exactly what Dad would have wanted. I stood between Mom and my older brother Liam as they lowered the casket, trying to process that my father was really gone. He'd been healthy until the heart attack took him at 63. No warning, no time to prepare, just suddenly absent from a world he'd filled with his steady presence. After the service, the lawyer asked us to stay for a brief meeting about Dad's will. We gathered in the funeral home's small office, Mom, Liam and me. The lawyer explained that Dad had left clear instructions. His estate would be divided equally between his 2 children. Mom would keep the house and Dad's life insurance, but the investment accounts and savings were to be split 50-50 between Liam and me. The amount was substantial, not millions but enough to change lives. Pay off student loans, buy a house, start fresh. Dad had worked his entire life to build that nest egg, always talking about leaving something meaningful for his kids. Mom squeezed my hand as the lawyer finished. She looked at both of us with tear-filled eyes and promised she'd make sure Dad's wishes were honored exactly as he'd intended, that we'd handle everything fairly and with the love Dad would have wanted. I believed her completely. The weeks after the funeral blurred together. Mom was devastated, barely eating or sleeping. I took time off work to stay with her, cooking meals she didn't eat and sitting with her through the long silences. Liam visited occasionally, but he had his own life across town, a struggling business, a strained marriage, always some crisis demanding his attention. I noticed small things during those weeks. The way Mom's face would light up when Liam called, even briefly. How she'd make excuses for why he couldn't visit more often. The subtle difference in how she spoke about our futures, Liam's difficulties framed as temporary setbacks, my stability treated as permanent and requiring no support. But I pushed those observations aside. This was grief talking, I told myself. Mom was just worried about Liam because he seemed more vulnerable. I was the responsible one, the one who'd always figured things out. Of course she felt she could lean on me more heavily. One evening she held my hand and thanked me for being so strong, for taking care of everything while she fell apart. She said Dad would be proud of how I was handling everything, how mature and selfless I was being. I felt good about that, felt like I was honoring Dad's memory by supporting Mom through the worst time of her life. The letter from the lawyer arrived 6 weeks after the funeral, a formal notice that the inheritance funds had been processed and distributed according to Dad's instructions. I'd been waiting for this, had plans forming for how to use the money responsibly. Pay off my student loans first, put a down payment on a small house, maybe take the vacation Dad and I had always talked about, the one we'd never gotten around to. I called the bank to check my account. The inheritance should have been deposited directly, but when the balance appeared on screen my stomach dropped. Nothing, no large deposit, no sudden windfall, just my regular paycheck and the small amount I'd managed to save. I called the lawyer's office, assuming there'd been some processing delay. The assistant put me on hold, then returned with confusion in her voice. The funds had been distributed exactly as specified, both checks sent to the address on file, my parents' house where Mom still lived. My hands were shaking when I hung up. There had to be a mistake. Maybe the check was sitting in Mom's mailbox, maybe she'd set it aside meaning to give it to me. I drove to her house immediately, my mind racing through innocent explanations. Mom was in the kitchen when I arrived. She took one look at my face and started crying before I'd said a word. She'd given it to Liam, almost my entire share, given to my brother to help him start fresh. Mom explained through tears that Liam needed it so desperately. His business was failing, his marriage was falling apart, he was drowning in debt. I was stable, employed, responsible. I'd be fine without the inheritance, but Liam needed it to survive. I stood in her kitchen, unable to process what I was hearing. This wasn't a small amount. This was my inheritance from Dad, money he'd explicitly split equally between his children, and Mom had decided, unilaterally, that my brother's needs outweighed Dad's final wishes and my financial security. She kept talking, trying to justify it. Liam had always struggled while things came easy to me. I had a good job, no major debts, a bright future. Couldn't I understand that family helped family, that sometimes sacrifices had to be made for the people we loved? I asked how much of my share she'd given him. She wouldn't give me an exact number, just said she'd kept a small amount aside for me, for emergencies, as if my inheritance was now an emergency fund she could control. The betrayal felt physical. Not just the money, though that hurt, but the fundamental breach of trust. Mom had looked me in the eye and promised to honor Dad's wishes, then systematically undermined everything he'd intended. I left without another word, her tearful pleas following me out the door. The family dinner the following Sunday was a disaster. Mom had invited both of us, probably hoping we could all move past this with some forced civility, but I wasn't capable of pretending everything was fine. Liam was defensive the moment I brought up the inheritance, said Mom had made the decision on her own, that he'd tried to refuse but she'd insisted. He needed the money, what was he supposed to do? Turn down help when his whole life was collapsing? I asked if he'd considered that maybe Dad had a reason for splitting things equally, that maybe I had plans and dreams too, that maybe it wasn't his decision or Mom's to override what Dad had explicitly wanted. Liam's response was cutting, said I'd always been the favourite, the one who succeeded at everything, that for once maybe I could handle not getting everything handed to me, that I was being selfish and petty about money while his marriage and business were failing. Mom tried to mediate, but her words just poured fuel on the fire. She kept talking about family sticking together, about not letting money divide us, as if she hadn't been the one who'd created the division by stealing my inheritance. I told them both I was done being the responsible one who got punished for stability, done subsidizing Liam's endless crises while my own needs were dismissed, done with a family that valued his chaos over my careful planning. I left and didn't look back. Starting over was harder than I'd expected. I'd been counting on that inheritance in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged. My apartment lease was ending, and I'd planned to buy a small place instead of renting again. My student loans could have been eliminated entirely. The financial breathing room would have changed everything. Instead, I was picking up extra shifts at work, stretching every dollar, moving into a smaller apartment I could barely afford. The stability everyone assumed I had was more fragile than anyone realized. I'd built it carefully over years, and losing the inheritance meant delaying major life plans indefinitely. Mom called constantly. I didn't answer. She left voicemails that oscillated between apologetic and defensive. Sometimes she was sorry for hurting me. Other times she reminded me that family was more important than money. Always underneath everything was the implication that I was being unreasonable by staying angry. Liam never called, not to apologize, not to explain, not even to acknowledge what had happened. The silence somehow hurt more than Mom's constant attempts at reconciliation. At least she felt guilty. Liam apparently felt entitled to my inheritance. Friends asked about the estrangement. I gave vague answers about family disagreements. The truth was too complicated, too raw. How do you explain that your mother stole your inheritance and your brother accepted it without question? Word spread quickly in our small town. People talked, they always did. I'd overhear conversations at the grocery store, at work, at the coffee shop I used to frequent. Liam's big comeback. The business he was starting, the fresh start he'd gotten, the way our mother had really come through for him. Some people knew the truth or parts of it. There were sympathetic looks when I ran into Dad's old friends. A few of them made comments about how Dad would have handled things differently, but nobody confronted Mom or Liam directly. It wasn't their place, they said. Family business should stay private. Then the whispers changed. Liam's startup wasn't going well. The money was disappearing faster than anyone expected. People who'd invested based on his promises were getting nervous. His wife had moved out. The fresh start was already failing. I felt a grim satisfaction hearing this, not because I wanted Liam to fail, though part of me did, but because it confirmed what I'd suspected. The inheritance wouldn't fix his problems because his problems weren't about money. They were about choices, patterns, a fundamental inability to build anything stable. Mom had sacrificed my financial security for nothing. Liam would burn through everything and be right back where he started, and I'd still be paying the price for her decision. The debt collector's call came on a Tuesday morning, a cheerful voice asking for Nora Westfield regarding an overdue credit card balance. I explained there must be a mistake. I didn't have that card, had never opened an account with that company. The collector rattled off an account number. Opened 3 years ago. My name listed as joint account holder with Liam Westfield. The balance was maxed out at $15,000 with 6 months of missed payments. My blood ran cold. 3 years ago, Liam had asked me to co-sign for a card to help rebuild his credit. Promised he'd manage it responsibly, just needed my good credit score to get approved. I'd reluctantly agreed because Mom had pressured me, saying family helped family. I'd forgotten about it completely. Liam had apparently been using and paying it normally until recently, but now the inheritance money was drying up and he'd stopped making payments, and because my name was on the account, I was equally liable for the debt. I called the credit card company, confirmed the nightmare. The account was in default, destroying my credit score. Unless someone paid immediately, they'd proceed with collections that could affect my ability to rent an apartment or get a car loan. I was now financially entangled with my brother's failing life, responsible for debt he'd accumulated while spending my inheritance. I confronted Mom that evening, showing up at her house unannounced. She looked exhausted, older than she had at Dad's funeral. The house was messier than I'd ever seen it, dishes piled in the sink, mail scattered across the table. I explained about the credit card, the debt, the destroyed credit score. Asked if she understood that Liam hadn't just taken my inheritance, he'd now trapped me in his financial collapse. Mom's defense was immediate and practiced. Liam was struggling, going through a difficult time, made some bad decisions, but he had a good heart. He just needed time to get back on his feet. Surely I could help him one more time, be understanding about the debt, maybe even help pay it off since I had that good job. I stared at her in disbelief. She genuinely thought I should pay off Liam's debt after he'd taken my inheritance, that I should solve problems he'd created while benefiting from money that should have been mine, that my stability existed to subsidize his endless chaos. I told her I wouldn't pay a cent, that I was done enabling Liam's dysfunction while being punished for responsibility, that she'd chosen her son over her daughter repeatedly, and now we'd all live with the consequences. She cried, said I was being cruel, that family forgave and supported each other through hard times, that I was abandoning them when they needed me most. I left her crying in that messy kitchen and didn't look back. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. Mom called from Liam's number. Her phone had apparently been shut off for non-payment. She needed money for groceries, for utilities, for basic living expenses. Liam was supposed to help, but he'd disappeared, wasn't returning calls. She asked if I could send something, just enough to get through the month. She knew I was angry, but surely I wouldn't let my mother go without food and heat. I'd spent my entire life being the responsible one, taking care of things, solving problems, ensuring everyone was okay. And what had it gotten me? A stolen inheritance, destroyed credit, and a mother who'd chosen my brother's chaos over my stability at every turn. I told her no, said she'd made her choices when she gave away my inheritance, that she'd chosen to enable Liam rather than let him face consequences, that I was done being the family ATM, the one who fixed everything while getting nothing but expectations and betrayal in return. Mom was shocked into silence. I'd never refused her before, never set a boundary that firm. She started to argue, to guilt, to remind me of all she'd done for me growing up. I cut her off, told her I loved her but I wouldn't keep sacrificing my life for people who didn't respect or value me, that I hoped she and Liam figured things out, but I was done being their solution. Then I hung up and blocked both their numbers. I met Claire at a coffee shop 3 months later. She approached me hesitantly, clearly nervous, and asked if I was Liam Westfield's sister. When I confirmed, she sat down without being invited and said we needed to talk. Claire had invested $10,000 in Liam's startup. He'd given her a compelling pitch about a tech platform that would revolutionize local business networking, shown her professional-looking materials, financial projections, even a demo that seemed legitimate. But the business had never materialized. The office address was a mailbox rental, the website disappeared, and Liam had stopped returning her calls. She hired someone to investigate and discovered the startup had no actual registration, no business license, nothing real behind the elaborate facade. She showed me documents on her phone, bank records showing where her investment money had gone, not to business development, to online gambling sites, sports betting platforms, virtual poker rooms. Liam had taken her investment and apparently others and gambled it away. I felt sick. The inheritance, Mom's savings, Claire's investment, probably money from dozens of other people, all fed into Liam's gambling addiction that apparently nobody had known about or acknowledged. Claire wanted to know if I could help her recover anything, if I had information about where Liam was or what assets he might have, but I had nothing. I'd been cut out of his life as effectively as I'd cut him out of mine. I confronted Mom one last time with Claire's information. Showed her the bank records, the gambling sites, the evidence that Liam's startup had been a complete lie, that my inheritance and her savings had been gambled away, not invested in some struggling but legitimate business. Mom didn't want to believe it, insisted there had to be another explanation. Liam had problems, but he wouldn't lie to her, wouldn't steal from her. The evidence had to be wrong, misinterpreted, taken out of context. I watched her mental gymnastics with something like pity. She built her entire identity around being the mother who saved her struggling son. Admitting he'd deceived her meant admitting she'd destroyed our family for nothing, that she'd sacrificed her daughter's inheritance and her own financial security for a son who'd lied to her face. Finally, I suggested she check Liam's bank account. She had access. I knew she did because she'd helped him set it up years ago. If the gambling records were wrong, his account would show the business investments she believed in. She logged in on her phone with shaking hands. I watched her face as she scrolled through transactions, withdrawals to online gambling sites, cash advances, desperate transfers trying to cover losses, not a single legitimate business expense. The phone slipped from her hands. She sat in silence for a long time. Then she started crying in a way I'd never heard before, not grief, realization, understanding that she'd destroyed her family for a lie. Liam disappeared a week later, cleared out his apartment overnight, leaving behind unpaid rent and furniture he couldn't fit in whatever vehicle he'd escaped in. His wife filed for divorce citing abandonment. The few remaining investors in his fake startup started looking for lawyers. Mom called me from a neighbor's phone. Hers had been shut off permanently. She was sobbing, barely coherent. Liam had cleaned out what remained of her savings before leaving, taken everything, including some jewelry that had been in the family for generations, just vanished with whatever he could carry or sell. She'd been enabling an addict, and he'd bled her dry before moving on to the next source of funding, probably in another city by now, running the same scams on new victims who didn't know his history. Mom was financially devastated. The house payments were behind, utilities were being shut off. She'd lost her savings, her jewelry, and her son in the space of a week. Everything she'd sacrificed my inheritance to protect had evaporated. Part of me felt vindication. She'd chosen Liam over me repeatedly, and now she was facing the consequences. But a larger part just felt tired, angry still, definitely, but also sad for the mother who'd destroyed her family trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. I helped her, not financially, I'd meant what I said about that, but I helped her contact social services about assistance programs, helped her negotiate payment plans with utility companies, showed her how to apply for food assistance and Medicare enrollment. Mom was humiliated. She'd always been the helper, the one who solved problems for others. Now she was the one needing help, depending on government programs and charity she'd always looked down on slightly. We didn't talk about the inheritance, or Liam, or the betrayal that had brought us here, just handled the immediate practical needs with minimal conversation. I came over twice a week to help with paperwork and phone calls, then left without staying for dinner or small talk. She tried to apologize once, started talking about how wrong she'd been, how she should have listened to me, how she'd destroyed everything for nothing, but I held up my hand and stopped her. I wasn't ready for apologies yet, might never be ready. Right now I was helping because she was my mother and she needed help, nothing more than that. The distance between us was vast, maybe permanent, but I couldn't watch her lose her house and starve regardless of what she'd done. That didn't mean I forgave her, just meant I wasn't a monster. 5 months passed. I worked, paid my bills, slowly started rebuilding. The credit card debt I'd been tied to with Liam went into collections, but I'd filed documentation proving fraud. It was a mess, but at least it wasn't actively destroying my credit score anymore. Mom and I maintained our distant relationship. Practical help, minimal conversation. She, aged years in months, the weight of her choices visible in every line on her face. Then the rumors started. Liam had been spotted back in town, living out of his car, apparently broke and desperate, hiding because multiple people were looking for him about unpaid debts and fraudulent investments. Mom came alive with hope. Maybe he'd come home, maybe they could fix things, maybe there was still a chance to salvage some relationship with her son. I watched her light up at the possibility and felt nothing but exhaustion. She was already preparing to forgive him, to make excuses, to enable the next cycle of his destruction. Some people never learned, not even when the lesson cost them everything. Liam called me 3 weeks after the rumors started, not from his number that had been disconnected, from some burner phone, his voice hoarse and desperate. He needed help, was in trouble. Could we meet somewhere private to talk? Every instinct told me to refuse. This was how it always went. Liam created disaster, then came crawling back expecting someone to fix it. And I was done being that someone. But curiosity won. I wanted to hear what he'd say. How he'd justify stealing my inheritance, gambling it away, and then vanishing when the consequences arrived. What possible explanation he thought would make any of this acceptable. I agreed to meet at a coffee shop in the next town over. Public enough to be safe, far enough from home that we wouldn't run into people we knew. Told him I'd give him 30 minutes, no more. He looked terrible when he arrived. Thinner, exhausted, wearing clothes that hadn't been washed in days. The confident older brother I'd known my whole life had been replaced by this hollow-eyed stranger who could barely make eye contact. We sat in the back corner, and Liam started talking. He admitted everything. The gambling addiction that had started years ago, long before Dad died, the debts that had been crushing him, the lies he told Mom and me and everyone else to keep funding his problem, the fake startup that had never existed beyond some convincing materials he'd created. He'd used the inheritance exactly as I'd suspected, not to start fresh or save his marriage or build anything real, just to feed an addiction that consumed everything. He'd gambled it all away in months, then kept gambling with borrowed and stolen money until there was nothing left to take. Liam's voice was hollow as he explained. No excuses, no justifications, just the flat recitation of someone who'd hit bottom and found it deeper than he'd expected. His marriage was over. His reputation was destroyed. He was facing potential legal action from multiple people he'd defrauded. Then he told me something I hadn't known. Part of the inheritance, a significant part, had gone to pay off Mom's debts. Debts I'd never known she had. Credit cards maxed out over years, personal loans taken to keep up appearances, a second mortgage on the house that Dad probably hadn't known about. Mom had been drowning financially long before Dad died. The inheritance was supposed to save her, and when Liam promised to help if she'd just give him my share, she'd agreed because she was desperate too. I sat there processing this new information. Mom hadn't just chosen Liam over me. She'd been in financial crisis and saw the inheritance as her only escape. But instead of being honest, instead of asking for help, she'd let Liam manipulate her into believing his lies and betraying me. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it explained it in ways that made the betrayal even more painful. She'd been desperate, and Liam had used that desperation to take everything. I'd brought my phone, set it on the table recording without being obvious about it. Wanted Liam's confession documented because I'd learned not to trust anything without evidence. The recording was clear, his admission of the fake startup, the gambling, the debts he'd paid with my inheritance money. Liam noticed the phone eventually, asked if I was recording. I confirmed that I was, told him I'd been burned too many times to trust verbal confessions. He just nodded, too defeated to even care about being recorded. Before I left, I asked him what he expected from me, what he thought this meeting would accomplish. Liam looked at me with empty eyes and said he didn't expect anything, just wanted me to know the truth, that he was sorry, that he'd destroyed everything and everyone he cared about and now had to live with that. I left him sitting in that coffee shop, the recording of his confession on my phone, and no idea what to do with either. The recording leaked 2 weeks later through Liam's ex-wife. She'd apparently been trying to track him down for unpaid alimony when a mutual friend mentioned I'd met with him. She contacted me asking for information, and when I explained what had happened, she asked if I had proof. I sent her the recording thinking she'd use it privately for her legal case. Instead, she posted it publicly online with a detailed explanation of how Liam had abandoned his family while gambling away money that wasn't even his. Within hours, his full confession was circulating throughout our town. People heard everything: the gambling addiction, the fake startup, the stolen inheritance used to pay debts, Mom's financial crisis, the systematic lies and manipulation, all of it laid bare in Liam's own voice admitting to everything. The response was swift and merciless. Local news picked up the story. Online forums dissected every detail. People I'd known my whole life suddenly wanted to share their own stories about loans Liam had never repaid, investments that had disappeared, lies they'd believed. I became the wronged party in public opinion overnight. No longer the daughter who'd abandoned her struggling family, but the victim of systematic betrayal by her brother and mother. People approached me with sympathy and support I hadn't asked for and didn't entirely want. Mom called, using yet another borrowed phone. She was devastated by the exposure, said it was one thing for our family to know the truth, another for the entire town to hear her financial and personal struggles broadcast publicly. But I felt detached from all of it. The public vindication didn't heal the private betrayal. Knowing everyone finally believed me didn't give me back what I'd lost. Mom showed up at my apartment a week after the recording went public. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by shame and consequence. Asked if we could talk, really talk, about everything that had happened. I let her in. We sat in my small living room and she apologized properly for the first time, not making excuses or deflecting, just acknowledging that she'd betrayed my trust, stolen from me, chosen to believe Liam's lies because facing the truth was too painful. She explained about the debts, how they'd accumulated over years of keeping up appearances, of trying to maintain a lifestyle Dad's income couldn't quite support. She'd been drowning and too proud to ask for help or admit she was struggling. When Dad died and left the inheritance, she'd seen it as her salvation, the way to wipe out her debts and start fresh. But the will had split everything between me and Liam, and she'd needed more than her portion could provide. So when Liam offered to help if she'd give him my share, promising to pay off her debts first, then use the remainder for his business, she'd agreed. Convinced herself it was temporary, that I'd be fine, that family took care of family this way. She hadn't wanted to see Liam's addiction, hadn't wanted to acknowledge he was lying. Facing that truth meant admitting she'd sacrificed her daughter for nothing, destroyed her family for a son who'd been manipulating her all along. Mom's apology was genuine, I could tell, but genuine apologies didn't fix broken trust, didn't restore what had been stolen, didn't erase months of struggle and betrayal. I told her I appreciated her honesty, that I understood the desperation that had driven her choices, but understanding didn't equal forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever. She accepted that with more grace than I'd expected, said she didn't deserve forgiveness, just wanted me to know the full truth, that she was ashamed of what she'd done and would spend the rest of her life regretting choices she couldn't undo. We sat in silence for a while, then she asked if maybe someday we could rebuild something, not the relationship we'd had before that was gone, but maybe something new, based on honesty instead of manipulation, on respect instead of expectation. I told her maybe, that I wasn't cutting her off completely but needed time and distance to heal, that she'd have to prove through actions, not words, that she'd really changed. She nodded and stood to leave. At the door she turned back and said one more thing. The lawyer had called, something about Dad's will, an appointment scheduled for next week that I should attend. The lawyer's office felt surreal. I hadn't been back since the reading of Dad's will, the meeting where everything had started to fall apart. Mr. Harrison, Dad's longtime attorney, greeted me warmly and asked me to sit. He had news about something called a trust fund. Apparently, Dad had created a secondary component to his will that hadn't been mentioned in the initial reading, a trust that would remain locked until certain conditions were met. The condition was proof of financial responsibility. Dad had been concerned about Liam's instability but hadn't wanted to show favoritism. So he'd created this trust, a significant additional sum, that would only be released to the child who demonstrated they could handle money responsibly. The trust had a 7-month waiting period and required documentation showing stable employment, no major debts, no gambling or addiction issues, and no legal problems. After 7 months, if one child met the criteria and the other didn't, the entire trust would go to the responsible party. Mr. Harrison pulled out files documenting everything: my stable employment history, my lack of debts beyond the student loans I'd been steadily paying, my clean credit report despite Liam's attempt to sabotage it, 7 months of responsible financial behavior while Liam had been gambling, lying, and defrauding people. The trust was being released exclusively to me. The full amount would be deposited into an account within the week. I sat in stunned silence as Mr. Harrison explained the trust fund's value. It was more than the original inheritance had been, significantly more. Dad had apparently been setting money aside for years into this separate account, building a safety net for whichever child proved they deserved it. Dad had known, maybe not about Liam's gambling specifically, but he'd understood his son's instability, had recognized that simply dividing things equally wouldn't be fair if one child would waste everything, so he'd created this contingency, a way to reward responsibility and protect the child who'd actually honor his values. Mr. Harrison said Dad had been specific in his instructions. The trust wasn't about favoritism, it was about stewardship. Money should go to someone who would use it wisely, build something meaningful, honor the work that had created it. If both children had been responsible, it would have been split equally, but only one of us had met the criteria. I thought about Dad setting this up, knowing it might drive a wedge between his children, but doing it anyway because he valued principles over peace, teaching a final lesson about consequences and responsibility even after his death. The irony was devastating. Mom had stolen my original inheritance thinking Liam needed it more, but by doing so, she'd proven exactly what Dad had suspected, that Liam would waste everything, and I was the only one who'd be responsible with the gift Dad wanted to leave. Liam left town permanently a week later. I heard through the small-town grapevine that he'd taken a bus to somewhere out west, probably running from debts and burned bridges, looking for fresh victims who didn't know his history. Mom got one call from a number she didn't recognize, Liam saying he was sorry and wouldn't be back. She grieved for the son she'd lost, but differently this time. Not denial or excuses, just sadness for the person he could have been if he'd made different choices. The relationship was over, she accepted that. He'd proven who he was too many times for her to maintain illusions. Mom kept working on her financial recovery. The assistance programs helped and she was slowly getting stable. We maintained our careful distance, not close but not estranged. I helped when she needed it, but boundaries remained firm. Trust would take years to rebuild if it could be rebuilt at all. The town's opinion had shifted completely. I was no longer the selfish daughter who'd abandoned her family. Now I was the responsible one who'd been wronged, the victim of her brother's addiction and her mother's poor judgment. People went out of their way to support me, to share their own stories of being deceived by Liam. I didn't enjoy the vindication as much as I'd thought I would. Being proven right didn't heal the wounds, didn't restore the year I'd lost to betrayal and struggle. I used Dad's trust fund exactly as he would have wanted, paid off my student loans completely, bought a modest house with a small yard, set aside a healthy emergency fund, and created a scholarship program in Dad's name for students studying financial literacy and business ethics. The scholarship had an unusual requirement. Applicants had to write an essay about a time they'd been tempted to take the easy path but chose the harder, more ethical option instead. About understanding that character was built through difficult choices, not convenient ones. I read those essays every year when selecting recipients. Stories from young people who'd faced pressure to cheat, to lie, to take shortcuts, who'd chosen integrity even when it cost them. Dad would have loved knowing his money was supporting people who understood the values he'd lived by. 6 months after receiving the trust fund, I got a letter from Mom, not asking for anything, just telling me she was proud of what I'd created, that Dad would have been proud too, that she finally understood why he'd structured his will the way he had. I stood in my small house, the one I'd bought with money earned through years of responsibility, and one final gift from a father who'd understood his children better than anyone had realized. Liam was gone, probably destroying himself somewhere new. Mom was learning to live with her choices, and I was building the life Dad had always hoped I'd create. The inheritance had cost me a year of pain, and a family I'd never fully recover, but it had also revealed truths that needed revealing. Sometimes karma worked slowly, rewarding patience and responsibility while letting chaos consume itself. I wasn't shocked by how everything turned out, just quietly grateful that eventually, inevitably, truth had found its way through all the lies. And the father who'd always valued responsibility over favoritism had made sure the right child received the gift he'd worked his whole life to create.